Question: what do coral reefs and much of the Russian Black Sea Fleet have in common? Answer: they're both endangered species and increasingly make for breathtaking underwater tourist attractions. Sure, maybe it's low-hanging fruit, but all jokes aside, Russia only has itself to blame for the current state of its once impressive navy, which most people, Putin included, thought would steamroll Ukraine when they invaded their neighbor in 2022. Ukraine, after all, did not technically even have a navy in the strict sense of the word. First impressions, however, can be deceiving. Over the last 2 years, Russia has managed to lose a combined total of approximately 16 ships and submarines, including the crown jewel of its Black Sea Fleet, the Slava-class cruiser Moskva, sunk by a pair of land-based Neptune anti-ship missiles. These are incredibly steep losses for an alleged great power, especially when you consider that most of the others were sunk by Ukrainian-designed, unmanned maritime drones packed to the rafters with explosives. These ingenious and relatively cheap systems, about $250,000 a pop, have become symbolic of Ukraine's technological savviness and innovative approach to naval warfare. Their asymmetric campaign has resulted in Russia's transformation from the indisputable maritime power in the Black Sea, on paper at least, to being pinned back into the eastern portion and unable to exert sea control over the region. Ordinarily, a military power with as much money, means, and manpower as Russia would double down on the omnipresent threat to its expensive naval assets. If the United States Navy were tasked with defending the Black Sea, it's easy to envision the strategy it would employ. One of its 11 carrier strike groups would almost undoubtedly be deployed to the region, which consists of an aircraft carrier, 2 guided missile cruisers for air defense, 2 LAMPS-capable warships for anti-submarine and surface warfare, and a pair of anti-submarine destroyers or frigates. The fleet would largely be insulated from traditional and hypersonic missile threats with robust and advanced cooperative engagement capabilities, DEW technology, and long-range interceptor missile technology. With enough support ships supplying munitions, fuel, and other supplies, carrier combat aircraft could conduct electronic warfare, hunt for enemy drones, and engage the bases from which they are launched almost indefinitely until the threat was entirely neutralized. US naval assets possess superior radar and electronic warfare suites to down drones, Phalanx CIWS automated guns with 20mm Vulcan cannons, and Skynex-type airburst munitions to engage close-in surface threats and drone swarms, and helicopter-launched missiles to wipe out any drone boats that made it through the fleet's wide defensive perimeter. It would almost be overkill, and the modern US military knows almost no other way. So, why doesn't Russia follow suit? Why not deploy its own aircraft carrier to the Black Sea to help neutralize the Ukrainian maritime fleet of what, in essence, amounts to a bunch of plastic water skis with a GoPro, smartphone, and a big boomstick attached to it? The answer is that it can't. The Russian carrier, known as the Admiral Flotta Sovetskogo Soyuza Kuznetsov, or Admiral Kuznetsov for short, has been undergoing a series of refittings and repairs that have relegated it to dry dock for the past few years. Though it was rumored to be ready to re-enter service by the end of 2024, experts are now wondering whether the carrier will ever sail again. Whatever its future, the vessel won't find itself anywhere near the Black Sea Fleet, or any Russian fleet for that matter, in the near or foreseeable future. Today, we're going to talk about why. If you want to measure a nation's true global power, it's often said that the best way is to look at its navy. But why? Naval vessels are expensive to produce and maintain. Only the richest nations with resources to spare can shoulder the cost of developing, testing, and projecting naval assets across the globe. As the most expensive and complex naval vessel, the modern aircraft carrier is, for good reason, almost universally viewed as the pinnacle of naval power. Those who have them can bring their bombs to bear in almost any corner of the world. Those that don't are forever doomed to the perennial role of a regional power. The history of Russia suggests that it should be at least on par with some of the world's most powerful nations at sea today. Of all Russia's service branches, the Soviet Navy was the fastest to expand after World War II. It had 421 ships of 8 different types, although these figures may be considerably larger. Its submarine fleet was world-renowned, and commensurate with its newfound status as a global power, the Soviets started to employ their navy much like the United States, to project power not just in their own geopolitical neighborhood, but around the world. From the Baltic to the Black Sea and the Arctic to the Pacific, Soviet vessels could be found performing anti-submarine, anti-ship, and anti-aircraft operations throughout the Cold War. The Soviets owed much of their post-1945 naval renaissance to the reforms of one man, Admiral Nikolai Kuznetsov, who argued for specialized missile-armed ships and submarines instead of more traditional battleships and heavy cruisers well ahead of his time. With the seizure of East German shipyards, laboratories, and industries in 1945, Kuznetsov started to turn his vision into reality. He's widely credited for having pressed the Soviets to experiment with hydrofoils, sound-seeking torpedoes, radars, sonars, guided missiles, and other advanced propulsion techniques that kept them apace with American technological advances, and in addition, for elevating the Russian Navy onto equal terms with the General Staff of the Ground Forces, thus setting up the Soviet Union for better joint coordination and strategic success for much of the Cold War. The Soviets adhered to a simple naval strategy at the time. They prioritized nuclear second strike capabilities and then used bombers, submarines, and large surface vessels to threaten NATO's sea lines of communication in the North Atlantic. By the 1970s, rapid advances in Soviet submarine, missile, and nuclear technology enabled them to challenge the United States' previously unquestioned naval supremacy for the first time. It took until 1985, however, for the Soviet Union to build its first aircraft carrier. Built by Black Sea Shipyard in Mykolaiv, Ukraine, the Admiral Kuznetsov was officially commissioned in January 1991 and became fully operational in 1995. After the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, however, everything started to unravel. The Soviet Navy originally intended to launch a sister ship, the Varyag, but the project was disbanded in 1991, where after its incomplete and stripped hull was sold by Ukraine to China, who rebuilt the Varyag as the Liaoning, the People's Liberation Army Navy's first ever aircraft carrier. The Kuznetsov was launched at a time of unprecedented geopolitical turnover and massive budget cuts. It was fatefully marked for an inauspicious future from the start of its turbulent service history. In 1991, Ukraine officially declared its independence from the Soviet Union. That year, acting Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev thwarted a coup attempt by communist hardliners to seize control of the country's political affairs. Gorbachev envisioned a more open, decentralized Soviet government with power distributed among the nation's 15 republics. His reforms may have rubbed the old guard of communist conservatives the wrong way, but they inspired nations like Ukraine, long held under the yoke of Soviet oppression, to exert themselves in foreign affairs. Accordingly, the same year, Ukraine's first elected president, Leonid Kravchuk, told the commander of the Kuznetsov, Viktor Yarygin, that the vessel was Ukraine's rightful property. Kravchuk ordered Yarygin to keep the ship in Sevastopol until the Ukrainian government could figure out what to do. Unfortunately for Kravchuk, Russian naval commander Yuri Ustimenko swooped in and ordered the ship's crew to sail to Russian waters so it could remain in the Soviet fleet. To this day, many Ukrainians still feel the Kuznetsov was unjustly stolen from them. In reality, they may have dodged a bullet. The ship has hung like a broken-down albatross around the neck of the Russian Navy ever since, becoming far more of a burden than a blessing. Before we get into the comically tragic tale of the Kuznetsov's modern service history, let's cover the basics. Relative to modern standards, and especially compared to the nuclear-powered American supercarriers like the Nimitz-class or Ford-class vessels, the Admiral Kuznetsov is modest, unwieldy, and inefficient, and that's putting it mildly. It is 1,000 feet long, it has a 236-foot beam and a 23-foot draft, and displaces 58,000 tons when fully loaded. Steam turbines, turbo-pressurized boilers, 4 shafts, and 4 fixed-pitch propellers drive the vessel through the water, each producing 2,011 horsepower. The ship has a maximum speed of 29 knots. By comparison, the Ford-class carrier, which has unlimited range, displaces double the weight, or 100,000 tons, holds double the aircraft and well over twice the crew, and is over 30 meters longer, can still travel 1 knot faster. The power generated by the Ford-class's 2 A1B nuclear reactors generate 250% more electrical capacity than the Nimitz-class carriers, enabling them to keep pace with far smaller vessels. The Kuznetsov does not run on nuclear power and has a maximum range of 9,800 miles and operational deployment time of 45 days before it must return to port. In their infinite wisdom, when the Soviets laid the keel of their lone carrier, they decided it would run on mazut, an outdated petrochemical that hasn't been used regularly for 50 years. Once seen as an eminently viable fuel for naval energy because of its high volume-to-energy ratio, it was soon found not only to be environmentally unsound, but dangerous for the ship's own crew. Mazut, you see, is incredibly vicious and tar-like. When burned, it emits a cloying, dense cloud of black smoke that clings to sailors' clothing and skin. In 2017, the vessel gained global notoriety when Britain's then Defense Secretary Michael Fallon dubbed it the Ship of Shame, as it passed through the waters close to the English coast, belching black smoke. So what exactly can the Kuznetsov do when it isn't in port topping off its fuel tanks with fresh batches of mazout? On paper, the carrier can carry 18 Su-33s, 6 MiG-29Ks, 4 Ka-31s, and 2 Ka-27s. It's designed to sail alone and, as a result, carries greater firepower than her US counterparts, who rely on escort vessels for mutual protection. Its armaments include 12 SSN-19 shipwreck, long-range high-speed sea-skimming SSMs, 24 VLS units loaded with 192 SAN-9 Gauntlet SAMs, and 8 Kashtan CIWS with dual 30mm machine guns, and 8 AK-630 CIWS. Compared to the 4 Phalanx CIWS and 4 Sea Sparrow launchers, each with 8 missiles carried by the Nimitz class, Admiral Kuznetsov is well armed for both air defense and offensive operations against hostile shipping. The problem, as you'll see later, is merely getting and maintaining the ship in the fight, not the fight itself. The way the Kuznetsov launches its aircraft is perhaps the most recognizable design feature, or flaw, depending on who you ask. Rather than utilize a modernized steam catapult to hurl heavily laden aircraft into the air off the carrier deck at breakneck speed, the Kuznetsov utilizes an old-school bow ramp. You know, the type of thing you and your friends built in grade school to launch your bike into the air in your front yard. The chief flaw of the bow ramp is that it supposes severe limitations on the types of payloads you can launch, which, in turn, constrains the types of missions you can conduct. Physics and gravity exert more of an influence on unassisted bow ramp launch operations. Consequently, the Kuznetsov's crew must adhere to strict takeoff weight limitations, which restrict the amount of ordnance and fuel a jet can carry, and in turn, reduces the jet's offensive effectiveness and range. When the carrier launched in 1995, Russian naval officers were optimistic that the Kuznetsov, deployed in tandem with their powerful submarines, might be able to help their nation remain a major global sea power, even as the country navigated its uncertain future. It didn't take long for fate to take its course. On its first deployment to the Mediterranean in 1996, the carrier was anchored off the port of Tartus, Syria, to conduct its first set of continuous flight operations. At one point during the mission, the carrier's evaporators broke down, stranding thousands of Russian sailors aboard with no fresh water. It was the start of an almost endless stream of technical, mechanical, and engineering issues. Over the next 20 years, Admiral Kuznetsov conducted a series of additional deployments and demonstrations in the Mediterranean, North Sea, Barents Sea, the Atlantic, and the Black Sea. Working with other Russian surface ships, it was pretty common to see the carrier involved in large-scale exercises, rescue operations, escort missions, and naturally, extensive maintenance whenever something broke or needed revitalization. In 2005, one of the carrier's Su-33 aircraft accidentally fell off the back into the Atlantic, one of the first indicators of the vessel's accident-prone reputation. 4 years later, a short circuit sparked a small fire aboard the ship while it was anchored off the Turkish coast. Carbon monoxide poisoning led to the death of one Russian sailor. Just a month later, the carrier found itself in the middle of a massive oil spill that resulted when it tried to refuel at sea with several other Russian vessels off the southern coast of Ireland. The crew was very grateful to return to dry dock for scheduled repairs over the next year. It was business as usual for 2 more years before the next incident struck. In February 2012, after a long, meandering journey around the tip of Scotland and into the Mediterranean, the Admiral Kuznetsov lost propulsion and set adrift in the Bay of Biscay on its return to its home base of Severomorsk. Embarrassingly, the carrier had to be towed the 2,700 miles back to Russia by tugboat, a gesture symbolic of the ship's next decade of service. It would not return to the high seas until 2014, having conducted just 6 overseas patrols across its 23-year lifespan thus far. Still, Russian naval officials were optimistic by the mid-2010s that despite strict financial constraints and recurring technical glitches, the Kuznetsov could remain operational well into the 2030s. Theirs was an incredibly rose-colored prognosis. By 2016, when the carrier set to sea en route to the Mediterranean, it had to be accompanied by 7 other vessels, including an ocean-going tugboat as a precaution due to potential propulsion failure. It pretty much always goes out with a tugboat, noted Dmitry Gorenberg, a senior research scientist in the Strategy, Policy, Plans and Programs division of the CNA. It's in extremely poor material condition, he added. The pilots are not proficient at all, they don't spend enough time at sea. Another popular military blog at the time put it more succinctly, calling the ship a piece of crap. And, well, they were right. In late 2016, things got pretty dire for the old admiral. Though its carrier air wing had been upgraded with the latest and greatest Russian multi-role aircraft and naval attack helicopters, its latest deployment to the Mediterranean suffered from a shortage of trained pilots, which limited the amount of fixed-wing aircraft it could launch at any given moment. As the carrier group approached the eastern coast of Crete, one of its MiG-29Ks took off from the carrier and returned as planned, only to find the Kuznetsov's deck crews were frantically repairing a broken arresting cable. The carrier commander, with plenty of time to divert the aircraft to a nearby airbase, dithered in the hopes his crew could fix the problem in time. Well, they couldn't. While circling the carrier, the plane ran out of fuel, forcing the pilot to eject into the sea. 2 weeks later, the Kuznetsov participated in its first ever combat operations, launching a series of Su-33 strikes against ISIS in Syria. The Russian Defense Ministry pointed out that the strikes were responsible for killing at least 30 enemy militants, including top field commanders. But Kuznetsov simply couldn't stay out of the news. A week later, another Su-33 crashed into the sea attempting to land on the carrier. The culprit? That darned arresting cable. It turns out it had been damaged even more than the technicians thought in the latest landing attempt. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. The carrier's air wing was transferred ashore to continue ongoing military operations. Meanwhile, in early 2017, the Russian Defense Ministry announced that the Kuznetsov would cease all operations in Syria, return to Russia, and begin a long-needed modernization program to overhaul its technical systems and extend its service by 25 years. This is where things get even more weird. You see, when ships go into dry dock for extensive upgrades, things are supposed to be safer. The environment is controlled, refittings occur on predictable, tight schedules, and crews have access to all the cranes, tools, and equipment they need to do their job properly in an ideal world. And so the Kuznetsov arrived at PD-50, one of the world's largest floating dry docks located at the 82nd Repair Shipyard in the village of Rosselyukovo, serving Russia's northern fleet based out of the neighboring port of Severomorsk, to have an invasive checkup. In the autumn of 2018, fate, karma, bad luck, or whatever you want to call it, again interrupted the Kuznetsov's regularly scheduled programming when the entire dry dock suddenly convulsed and sank into the sea, collapsing cranes onto the carrier's deck and sending shipyard workers scrambling for their lives. Somewhere along the line, the pump system that controlled the dry dock's buoyancy lost power, flooding its ballast tanks with water far in excess of their maximum point. 4 dock workers were wounded, another went missing. While certain Russian officials claimed the Kuznetsov was undamaged in the incident, other outlets were quick to report that there was now a 5-meter gash in the hull of the ship around the waterline and that the deck was supposedly opened up with intricate machinery exposed when the crane fell on it. Much to the Navy's consternation, the industrial accident looked set to delay the Kuznetsov's refit longer than anticipated. And then, a year later, in 2019, the ship caught fire again. Though Russia no longer possessed a dry dock large enough to accommodate a vessel of that size after the sinking of PD-50, it had stubbornly pressed on with the tortured refit when a fire broke out during repairs to the first power unit, sending a thick plume of black smoke into the sky as burning diesel fuel and power cables caused a thick cloud of acrid black smoke to fill the ship's cramped corridors and increased the engulfed area 6-fold to 120 square meters. This estimate made by the Russian TASS news outlet was said to be well short of the mark. Other agencies posited that the blaze covered up to 600 square meters. 8 repairmen had to be rescued from the inferno, 1 remained unaccounted for. Most blame the fire on safety violations. It would be par for the course. The fire damage cost an estimated $8 million, although some sources cite that number may be higher. The Kuznetsov by this point had already become the brunt of international jokes in the press and military circles. Its embarrassing overhaul was only adding insult to injury. Repairs were delayed through 2021, with Russian officials citing bad weather as the chief cause. Okay, it took until May 2022 to return the ship to a new dry dock built in Murmansk after the sinking of the PD-50. When it finally drained in July 2022, repairs continued in earnest. That is until December 2022, when the ship caught fire again. In Samuel Taylor Coleridge's famous poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, a man at sea inexplicably shoots an enormous seabird that had been flying alongside his vessel for several days. As the bird died, the wind immediately ceased blowing. Irate with the mariner and fully convinced the bird had magically made the wind blow, his crew made him wear the albatross around his neck until it rotted, a heavy burden that acted as a constant reminder of his senseless decision. By this point in the Admiral Kuznetsov's long life, an honest reading of the past 30 years would seem to indicate that the vessel, much like the mariner's albatross, is an unnecessary burden around Russia's neck. Russia seems to be blithely ignoring the chronic shortcomings, tragic losses, and damaged prestige incurred by the vessel's poor design. They remained committed to getting the ship operational sometime in 2023. Now things are looking as bad as ever as the ship, like the Albatross, seems to be decomposing at the 35th Ship Repair Plant in Murmansk. A recent Defense Intelligence report indicated that even at this late stage of its refitting, the ship could not relocate from the dry dock to one of the repair plant's piers under its own power, but that it still had to be pulled by a series of several tugs. They tried and failed to move the hulking steel mass owing to the critical condition of the ship's hull. Examinations to the hull revealed that the metal structures below the third deck of the ship were significantly corroded. The holds are filled with muddy water, which makes it impossible to examine the ship in detail from the inside. Today, repairmen are warning the Russian military to deploy the Kuznetsov at their own risk. Its condition, they argue, leaves it with a high probability that it would sink or capsize. Russian naval officials, repairmen, and defense contractors are now hurling blame at one another for the vessel's dismal bill of health. Now nobody knows whether the Kuznetsov will be able to return to service in 2024 or not. This all begs the question, if it's more trouble than it's worth, why doesn't Russia simply scuttle the ship? It all goes back to the way Russia hopes the world perceives it as a global and not a regional naval power. For decades, Russia has been in the process of modernizing its surface fleet with larger numbers of smaller, technologically advanced vessels. Yet it has doggedly clung to many of its older, larger units, vestiges of the Soviet era when it was truly on the brink of becoming a major sea power. Just as Ukraine's sinking of the Moskva in April 2022 was viewed globally as an attack on Russia's perception of itself as a sea power, one expert has observed that scrapping the Kuznetsov would be akin to scrapping the idea of Russia being a great sea power. This, put simply, is just not on the cards for Russia's current cast of leaders. Today, Russia can't afford to build any new large warships of consequence. Until it achieves its long-term strategic goals in Ukraine, this trend looks set to continue for the foreseeable future. In the interim, the Russian Navy will be forced to maintain and modernize its current fleet, so even though its lone carrier is prone to spontaneous combustion, puts its crew in undue danger, remains reliant on external tugs for propulsion, and occasionally forces its pilots to eject at sea, it is and will remain the golden child of the Russian fleet until its leaders see the writing on the wall. Now go and check out why all Russian weapons are a failure, or click this other video instead.